I am Dr. Sydney McKinney. I am the Executive Director of the National Black Women's Justice Institute. And I just want to thank you all so much for joining us for our book club. Tonight, we will be talking to Dr. Treva Lindsey about her recent book, America Goddam: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice. Before we get too deep into tonight's incredible discussion, I just want to point people to the closed captioning. If you need closed captioning, depending on what your screen looks like, if you click on the more button, that's not right. If you click on, sorry everyone, there is a box that says CC, live transcript. There you go. Just keep making your screen bigger. You click on that and it'll give you the option of having the live transcript at the bottom of the screen. You could actually also have it show up on the side of the screen, but if that is something you need, that is available. So the National Black Women's Justice Institute is a nonprofit research, policy, and capacity building organization. We are working to end the systemic criminalization of Black women and girls, and we intend and are working to dismantle the racist and patriarchal criminal legal system that exists today and build in its place pathways to healing and opportunity for directly impacted Black women, girls, and gender expansive people. At National Black Women's Justice Institute, we believe that real justice is healing. So last year, we launched this incredible book club, which I have to say I love, one, because it makes me read more, but two, I get to be in the presence of really brilliant Black women who are really elevating and bringing attention to the criminalization of Black women. And so our intent is to really elevate these issues for you and to do so in a way that we are centering Black women's scholarship and stories. We are telling our stories of what the impact of criminalization is on our lives, and we are thinking together and working together to make a change. So today we have Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. She is a professor at The Ohio State University, the co-founder of Black Feminist Night School at Zora's House, and founder of the Transformative Black Feminisms Initiatives at OSU. Her research and teaching interests include African American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminisms, and sexual politics. Her most recent book, America Goddam: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, was described as, in quote, required reading for all Americans. And Melissa Harris Perry recently tweeted, so go find the tweet, that America Goddam is one of the most powerful accounts of violence against Black women and girls that you'll read this year. And she went on to say that Lindsey's focus on liberation is hopeful yet honest. And I must agree. I think the book is incredible, and I am so appreciative that you really put so much of your time and energy and self into writing this book. It is such an excellent discussion and makes visible the multiple ways that violence, particularly systemic violence, shapes the lives and lived experiences of Black women and girls, and create what you call throughout the book unlivable living conditions that we're forced to endure. And that was such a powerful phrase. It really resonated for me in thinking about what it is to be a Black woman in this world. And so I'm hoping you can get us started by talking to us about what motivated you to write America Goddam.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your book club series, which is amazing. I'm a fan. So it's always a pleasure to be in the space where you're being interviewed on this and in conversation when I've been listening so intently to these conversations. So thank you for all of the work that you do. I'll have to be completely honest with y'all. I did not want to write this book. And I say that to say, I did not know that I had the bandwidth, the capacity, the emotional fortitude that it would take to be as honest as I needed to be to write this book as accurately, as intimately, and as dynamically and multifacetedly as it needed to be. And so I was going to write a 90s book. That was going to be my next book project. I am such a 90s kind of girl. I wanted to write about culture and fun and all of this. And I'd always been writing about violence in particular ways since college, been invested and engaged in different organizations and initiatives and collectives that are committed to ending violence in multiple forms: sexual violence, patriarchal violence, mass violence, wars of aggression, militarism. So broadly speaking, really thinking about the work of peace. But I also knew that it would take my own journey being at the center in certain ways of the motivation to actually write this book, that being my experiences as a survivor of multiple forms of violence, to be able to go into these archives, both at the macro level, the big archive, and then my own personal archive and the archives of those in my life who I knew had been affected by violence or this predisposition towards premature death, which I frame in the context of the book as unlivable living, and the unique experiences that came with that as Black women and girls. And there were all these little signs along the way, whether it was a lot of my public writing, starting around the 2010s, ended up being about violence. That's what I was being asked to write about. And I kept witnessing and having to then witness, which means it resides within you, these different moments of violence, whether that be police violence, intimate partner violence, the violence of being unhoused, being impoverished, the violence of the names and disrespect that often Black women and girls and gender expansive people endure. And I was like, okay, I think something's pushing me to write this daggone book and asking me to be a part of the community of scholars, activists, artists, writers, creators doing that heavy lifting, that I wouldn't be alone, but this was something that I was being called to do. And in the book, I discuss a particular incident that happened while I was home in DC visiting my mom during the uprisings of 2020, and of course, during the initial shelter in place that occurred during COVID, and witnessing an incident that confirmed for me that, Treva, you have to write this book, and that you have to get out of your own way and then get into your own way to be able to write this in the way that is honest and precise and accurate, that I knew was a call for the book initially.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know what incident you're talking about, but I'm hoping you could actually share that
Sure.
story, because it's a very powerful, your description of what you and your mother witnessed and how your response was, incredibly personal and powerful. And for all of us who lived through COVID, I'm sure saw something similar. And so if you could just tell us about that particular incident that was for you the moment that you knew you had to do it.
So my mom and I, my mom lives right outside of DC. I'm from the DC area originally, and I'd gone home to celebrate her 70th birthday with her. And so I drove straight from Columbus, Ohio, didn't want to stop anywhere, which is a drive you probably want to keep driving anyway, because you're going through some areas that are not that wonderful towards Black folks. And so when we got home, we were on our way to go pick up her hair cream, which at this point, you're still picking up stuff outside the store. There's all of these protocols. And we're sitting on a major street in the Washington, D.C. area, Branch Avenue, if anyone out there is familiar with the D.C. area, but it's a multi-lane street route that has a divider down the middle, a median down the middle for the opposite sides of traffic. We noticed a van in front of us, and through the mirrors, we can see that this, what appears to be a young man, assaulting this young woman. And ultimately, this young man throws this woman out of the car and throws her stuff off and pulls off. And we're just appalled. I'm like, my mom and I decided to pull over. A few other cars also pull over because the young woman is just on the ground in the middle of this very, very, very busy street. And she's crying and she's hysterical and she's still yelling for him to come back. She also has a hospital ID bracelet on and a bandage over her neck that indicated, to me at least with my Grey's Anatomy medical education, that she perhaps had recently been intubated. And so we're worried, we're trying to navigate this with her, and we're all upset that this has happened, that this young man has left her, this young man was assaulting her, and at this point, she also starts to seize. We don't know at the time, but someone has called the police, but we don't know this because none of us directly did call the police. And we also noticed that the young man has come back down the other side of the highway and has come back to the scene. And he's trying to pick her up off the ground as she's seizing. And he's like, what happened? He's asking as though he doesn't know what happened. Like, was she hit by a car? It's one of those moments where I'm so angry and so frustrated with this young man. And yet my concern is this young woman who's seizing right in front of us. Her medical papers are on the ground and someone informs us that she's epileptic. And so that's what's happening. And so we're just trying to turn her on her side, make sure she's not choking, and keep her home until help comes. And it's one of those moments where we're all anxious because this is still during the points where there's very active protests that are happening with respect to the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade. And so there's this intense feeling of what happens when the police get here. And the paramedics come first, and then the police get there on the scene, and we're all very anxious, very nervous, upset still, but wanting the young woman to be cared for by the paramedics and not be asked all these stupid questions. She's clearly seizing, please help her. And then we notice that the scene is escalating with the police and the young man. And so at this point, a few of the cars drive off, but a few of us stay because now we're concerned about the well-being of this young man. We don't want him gunned down. None of us want to be bystanders to that, or bystanders to something perhaps even worse. And so we then are creating somewhat of what I would consider this implied barrier between him and the police by witnessing what's happening and not leaving the scene until we're sure that he is not physically harmed either. And the police allow him to leave, and I'm filled with all of these emotions when I get back in the car, most of which are being so angry that this even happened, but feeling like there was no other choice for me but to ensure the safety of everyone on that scene and the well-being of everyone on that scene, despite harm having been done by one of the actors on the scene. And that made me go home and think, how do I write through this? How do I think through this? How do I narrate what just happened? And to think about what we ask Black women to do, this concept of silently enduring and unequivocally protecting those who harm us, while also recognizing that the criminalization or the harming of this young Black man also didn't sit well with me and doesn't build a safer community per se, right? And safe outside of a kind of carceral notion or criminal legal system notion of what safe can mean.
Thank you so much. I remember reading that and just everything that you described, just the anxiety of that situation that you and your mother encountered was so, palpable, and being concerned for everyone involved. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why it was important for you to tell these stories that are really contemporary in nature. You are a historian by training, and so much of what we expect to see from historians are books about 1850 and 1619 and early 1900s, but you took this very different approach of how we explore and understand the criminalization and violence that Black women experience by telling stories that I'm sure everyone who is here today knows, some of which we actually lived through. So yes. Tell me about that decision, because it is a really unique take on history. And I think it was very effective, but just very different than what we would usually consider.
Yes. So one of my favorite high school teachers once told me that the discipline of history and how we evaluate and assess historical documents, methods, etc., is looking at PIP. And I tell my students this: power, ideology, and perspective, right? And so where does power reside? Who has the power to tell these stories? What perspectives are brought forth in these stories? Whose perspectives are empowered to tell the stories that are included in historical records? And what are the ideologies behind them, right? What are the ideologies that contextualize this work? Why is this work coming out now? So when I ask for myself what the stakes are of this work, is that so many of the data points that I was encountering that I knew from the work that I had done previously, or looking at historical work from the 1800s or the early 1900s, suggested to me that there's always an underassessment of what is actually happening to Black women and girls at any different point in history. So why not use my historical training and thinking about power, ideology, and perspective in the context of the 21st century to refuse that erasure, to refuse that silencing, to dig deeper with these stories that already are history in many ways, but to add that to a growing archive of how we understand what Black women's lived experiences have been, what Black girls' material realities have been, and to connect them to the material realities, the lived experiences, the technologies of violence that have been a part of the US experience since the US robbed Indigenous people of their homelands, right? And so I think it's very important not to say what's happening in 1700 is what's happening in 2022. However, it is important to think about structurally, systemically, and institutionally the genealogies of violence, the legacies of, the afterlives of many of the things that are in the historical archive that we tend to think about as real history, and put this in a place where we're saying, I'm insisting that we tell these Black girls' stories. I'm insisting that we tell these Black women's stories. I'm insisting that we take seriously the realities of Black gender expansive people and connect that to our analyses, which in fact can hopefully affect how we organize, how we make policy, how we advocate, how we activate, and how we mobilize for liberation, for justice, for freedom, right? More broadly.
I really appreciate that. I love history, but the stories, as informative as I find them for thinking about the systems and structures that criminalize and punish, and the kind of continuity over time that exists, the thing that is difficult is relating to the stories, right? Because I wasn't alive in 1910, and our world has changed. So while some of the systems and methodologies of power and coercive controls continue to exist, and in very similar forms, there's just a kind of disconnect because I'm not of that moment. And so what I really love that you did is you put, like, we are in this moment. All of us are in this moment. And so it just kind of really it creates a connection, and a real personal connection, and that I think is hard to have in more traditional historical analysis.
Yeah, I think that intimacy that you're talking about there, and there is a kind of vulnerability in doing more recent or contemporary history, because many of the people I'm talking about, their loved ones are living. They are people who I feel accountable to in terms of the work that I do. I discussed this a couple of times, but the epilogue to the book is a love letter to Ma'Khia Bryant, who was killed the same day that Derek Chauvin was convicted for murdering George Floyd. Those are literally within a very short time frame of each other on the same day. And I had finished my book and it was in production. And I just took a moment because I'm processing, I'm grieving. This is the loss of a young Black girl in my own community who was killed minutes away from where I live in Columbus. And I'm accountable to her loved ones when I write about her. And that's very different from writing about some of the figures I've written about in the past in the 19th century, where I'm talking about the descendants of who absolutely have a stake, of course, in the legacy and the story and the truth telling that happens with their stories. But there's something at stake for Ma'Khia Bryant's family in the way that I tell this story. If I'm holding her warmly, if I'm holding her with care, if I'm repeating what police have said about her, what the criminal legal system has said about her, what the city government has said about her, what dangers that poses to her actual family in this moment, her community in this moment. And that shifts accountability in a real way. And as a historian, our accountability practices are very different. And it's not because they're bad. I'm trained as one. I honor the traditions that we have, the ethics that are set up within the profession, but my ethics are grounded in a queer Black feminist framework, which means the people that I'm writing about, I'm also writing alongside and writing with. And so their voices, their editorial perspectives, their understanding of these experiences that I'm documenting and chronicling and analyzing and using to paint this bigger picture to show the gravity of the stakes of what we're up against matter. And for me, that meant a kind of intimacy. That meant sending the letter to her family before it goes through this academic process, that it first resonated as truth to them. It resonated as reflective of what actually happened to their loved one. And that's one of the reasons why in the book, I try and name them by their first names when I'm referring to their stories, to create that intimacy that you're talking about, Sydney. That was really important to me, that this be life affirming, even though we're talking about death dealing. That is super important in the way to approach this, and to invite the reader into investing in the lives of Black women and girls and gender expansive people.
I so appreciate that you did that throughout the book. I feel like we are often thinking about the same thing here at the National Black Women's Justice Institute. So much of our work and the way that we approach our work is that we want to center and elevate and amplify the voices of directly impacted Black women and girls, their experiences, and really center them as experts, right? Which is so often a position that they are denied. And so I really, really appreciate this attempt that I think you are very successful at, of presenting people as whole people, because so often we do not see Black people, we do not see Black women as whole people. And you make a point about how important it was when you were writing this, and you really lead with the story of the killing of Breonna Taylor, but you also say, I'm not just going to talk about her death, I'm going to talk about who she was. And so that really, I think is really important, because so often when we are talking about criminalization and punishment of Black women, we are denying, not us, but so often the public denies them their humanity. And it is so important for us in our work to make sure people see them as whole people, to see them more than the worst day of their life, yes, or the moment when their life was taken from us. So I thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of those things that, most of the figures in this book are figures that I didn't know until this spectacular moment happened, until the worst day of their life or the last day of their life, right? That's when I come to know them. And that's a very particular position to take when wanting to chronicle or document someone's life, which is typically what historians are doing, right? That we're meeting them after the thing has already happened, the event, the figure has long passed, or the impact that they had that was historically significant has already occurred. But what does it mean when the loved ones are still in the middle of civil suits with cities, are still protesting are still on a very practical level missing the mundane things about the person that they love because their life was snuffed out, right? What are those, what does it mean to write from that kind of knowing of what it means to lose someone? And because in the book I talk about people who I've lost, and the impact that that had on me, that deeply affected how I approach this as a writer, as someone who was deep in the archive to write this book, and who was kind of amassing an archive, pulling together this more contemporary archive to tell this story. That it meant the pain that I was writing through, the desire I had to make sure that people in the book that I knew that had been harmed or killed were seen in life-affirming ways, was that for everyone in the book, which required a different kind of research, because all you're going to get from a news story, or you're going to get from, even from an organizing standpoint, is the thing that happened. And I think what's so important about organizations such as National Black Women's Justice Institute is that that healing and that notion of personhood and humanity is central to the ways that you're doing the work that you're doing. And it's central to me as a historian, as a feminist scholar, as a queer Black feminist scholar, to ensure that that's never lost, even when I'm in the deep of some pretty horrible things and horrifying things and unbearable things, that it is possible to still affirm their lives and their significance to the communities and the kinship networks and the families that these individuals belong to.
And I think that one thing you do so well in the book is you really give people their personhood, and it feels so much of what you talk about is how misogynoir and anti-Black racism really like create these conditions that create the unlivable living conditions for us. And so it feels like this, pushback and fighting against misogynoir by giving and sharing the wholeness of the Black women whose stories you elevate. And so I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about, because I think that's a really interesting lens through which to understand the violence and criminalization that Black women and girls experience. If you could talk about how misogynoir helped you come to understand and unpack and see the layers and complexity of the violence that we endure on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. So shout out first to Moya Bailey and So Trudes for coining and fleshing out this term and entering it into our lexicon of the ways that we can identify what is happening to Black women and girls. Because I think before that term, we were naming things and we were identifying things, and it was important that we were doing that, and something was still missing. And that's the great thing about inquiry. We're always finding ways to identify the thing that we're already living, right? That's what that language allows for us, to name what we're already experiencing. And in naming that, it made me able to think about violence and violation more broadly. So it was easiest for me to think about violence and violation in the context of like someone being gunned down, someone being killed by a police officer, someone being killed by an intimate partner, being sexually assaulted or violated by someone. Those made incredible sense to me. And I knew what the numbers were surrounding that Black women and girls and gender expansive people were overrepresented in those forms of violence across the board. But where misogynoir became particularly helpful for me is to name those that are not as easily perceived as violence or violation, that violability that I talk about, the kind of predisposition to be harmed, the demand to survive the wholly impossible, which is literally the tagline for Nannie Helen Burroughs' School for Training Colored Girls. She knew even in the early 20th century that what we were being asked to do was to survive the wholly impossible. And so I thought about that when I thought about maternal mortality and morbidity, that even holding for class, which usually is a metric by which we see so many health disparities meted out, who has insurance, who doesn't, who has access to healthcare and hospitals and care and all of that, that we're still seeing incredibly disparate rates of maternal death among Black people, Black birthing people, Black people with gestational capacity. So I had to think like differently about that. Like, what does it mean to see the convergence of anti-Blackness and misogyny that then net out in those ways, that met out in medical outcomes, that met out in the ways that we casually use certain terms to describe drug addiction. In the book, I talk about the difference between the opioid patient and the crack whore. And I grew up in the generation of the crack whore, crack baby, crack this, crack. And I mean, it was so derisive, so dismissive, so evacuative of personhood from those who were living with addiction. And to opioid patient, which literally was about this kind of suburban white woman, cis woman who is struggling because she got addicted to painkillers, and the compassion that that term elicits was so important in terms of framing that, which is not to say I don't want us all to be considered patients when we're living with addictions that we're attempting to no longer be living with, right? But simply that one promotes a healthcare response and one promotes a criminalizing response. And even if it did get a healthcare response, we know that Black women, Black people are largely getting careless care in these systems. And so misogynoir became a beautiful opening to identify the depths at which Black women and girls and gender expansive people are experiencing advanced marginalization, are experiencing multiple forms of oppression simultaneously, and that they're walking into every situation in their life with that already in the scaffolding of the possibility of outcomes.
Thank you. There are these moments when I feel like you're taking me to church and I am like, this is, oh. So I wanted to ask you, and you kind of deal with this in the beginning of your book, but often in this country, when we're talking about policing and we're talking about violence, we're talking about criminalization, we are not talking about Black women and girls. Yeah. We are saying Black people, but we are often using cisgender Black men as our default and not really challenging the language that is used and really what it is meant to signify. You do something very intentional in this book where you are focused on Black women. And I'm hoping you can share a little bit more about why. And I'm curious if you encountered any pushback, because you kind of do make this case that like, hey, I care about Black men too, but if you could just talk about that.
Yes. So I care about Black men too, right? And sadly, Black feminists, Black womanists, Black gender progressive folks who are doing this work, who are interrogating racism and patriarchy and anti-Blackness and transphobia, and have long had to couch that, right? And I'm like, let's move this but to an and. Like, I deeply care about the outcomes for cisgender Black men and boys, as I can think through a number of ways that it's so important to hold that. And I'm not trying to create an oppression Olympics, because that's not useful to me. What is useful to me is precision, is rigor, and then to looking at the specificity with which different groups, even within a group, so intragroup wise, that we're combating. So what does it mean to think about police violence, where if we look at women, and often we see men are more likely to encounter violence in kind of state context, police violence context, carceral violence, we know that across the board. But if we look at Black women, we're outpacing almost all men except for Black men and boys. And I want to know why. And I want to tell that story. I want to see why we see such incredible violence in terms of policing violence in the homes or right outside of the homes of Black women and girls. That is a frequency with which we see that kind of violence, whether we're talking about Eula Love in the 80s, Deborah Danner in 2016, Eleanor Bumpers in 1988, or Ayanna Stanley Jones sleeping on her couch in Michigan. And so I think that there's a really important way that we began to understand the spaces and places where this kind of violence is happening, to also bring Black women to the fore. That because often it's happening in these out of plain sight, out of public view sites, we don't have these videos. We don't have these witnesses like 17-year-old Darnella Frazier, who films the murder of George Floyd. We don't often have that for Black women and girls. So some of this was bringing that record to the fore, to use the book in any of its forms as a record of what is happening and what is occurring. It also meant talking about patriarchy in very substantive ways. And that does mean talking about what is happening intracommunally, while not bending into pathologizing or criminalizing narratives about cisgender Black men and boys. But if we look at harm and how it's happening, where it's happening, the frequency with which it's happening, we have to talk about the role that patriarchal violence plays in that. And I want to be in the tradition of Ntozake Shange and Alice Walker and Pat Parker and Mariah Stewart and many other activists who for years have been calling in the dynamics of patriarchal violence within our communities, and thinking about the ways that white supremacy and anti-Blackness intersect and collide with those to create a unique set of conditions for Black women and girls, who then are experiencing far more violence than I think we've even really wrapped our hearts and minds around. And it became important to write it in this moment, because even when you have something like the movement for Black Lives, broadly construed, that has so many Black women, Black trans folks of all genders, Black people of all genders at the core, at the founding, at the root, right at the start, that even then, the focus still almost exclusively in terms of energy, resources, amplification, and mobilization pivoted around Black men and boys. And so it meant a lot for me to say, look, even when we're there, we're still not fully bringing to the fore what's happening to Black women and girls. And so I wanted to be part of a growing chorus of those of us who are saying, it's us as well. And I don't even want to say us too, because that almost makes it sound like this just started happening, or this is some addition we're attempting to bake. We have never not been the victims of extraordinary anti-Black white supremacist and patriarchal violence in this nation. And we've never been absent from the resistance to that either.
So very true. And as I've thought back to the various scholars that we have who have joined us for the book club, so many of them are historians for that exact reason, right? The criminalization and the violence and the policing and surveillance of Black women and girls did not start today. There is this long history, and people like you have been writing about it. And so it is really important for us to think about the recent history in the way that you have so beautifully laid it out for us in your book, but also see the connections to, the incredible books that other historians like Callie Gross and Cheryl Hicks and LaShawn Harris have written that are really doing part of the same project.
Absolutely. And I like to give people examples of thinking about like why this matters deeply. So even in the ways that we contextualize and understand what's happening right now, there are ways that people are referencing histories even when we don't know the depth. So when people were thinking about Black folks in relationship to the healthcare system, particularly as COVID, as most disasters are, disparately impact Black communities and Black people, that a lot of the hesitancy about the kind of care we would receive, et cetera, was like, you heard this referencing of Tuskegee, right? The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the study that we know, I think it's lodged into our minds as a prime example of just how racist the medical industrial complex is and has been. And I never want to destabilize that or decenter that in our understanding, but we can look so far back and see the experimentation on Black women and girls. We can see the maligning of the usage and exploitation of Black women and girls in the 1900s in a similar period, whether we're thinking about forced sterilizations or the Mississippi appendectomy, of which freedom fighter Fannie Lou Hamer was a victim, Or we can look to the founding of modern gynecology as we understand it and know it by J. Marion Sims and his experimentation on Black women, enslaved Black women as a result of, and his counterparts in the 18th and 19th century. Medical journals are using Black women and girls, plantation doctors are using Black women and girls to advance medicine, and not providing them with care. We can even look at healthcare on slave ships and see the ways that this kind of harm doing is embedded into the health system, to think about that. And so I use that example often, not to say decenter Tuskegee, but to say, look, y'all, we have this robust archive that we're not using, that we're not engaging to mobilize and to amplify what we're talking about. Because when we singularly think about it through the lens of Tuskegee, or singularly think about anti-Black violence through the lens of cisgender Black men and boys, there's a way that we can make that this kind of micro spectacular thing, as opposed to this all-encompassing, structurally and systemically and always evolving multidimensional reality that is disparately impacting Black people of all genders, right? And I think that's a really important thing to be able to do in this fight. And I think it gives us more ground, it gives us more standing, it gives us more rooting to know that this is this widely shared experience with these different specificities. There are things that are distinctly violent for Black men and boys and masculine people. And I think it's important to look at that as well. So I want more work that does that, but I think often the work that doesn't get amplified and noticed and used to think about these issues are works that focus on Black women and girls.
I really, really appreciated the work that you did, really elevating the ways in which the medical system is violent and harmful towards Black women. We are actually currently doing a study of formerly incarcerated Black women and how they navigate healthcare post-incarceration. And one of the motivations was working with partners who were kind of had an onslaught of new clients and women they were working with who had very serious chronic medical conditions, but could not access healthcare. And so this way in which you talk about careless care, for me, really resonates and feels like an important framing for understanding the way, like how healthcare is present or not present in the lives of formerly incarcerated women. And for you to tell those stories of Serena Williams, right? Like a very powerful, well-known, respected Black woman, and doctors aren't listening to her. What's wrong with her? It made me really think about how difficult it must be for the most vulnerable women.
Absolutely. And that was the point, right? If Serena Williams, right, the GOAT, right, is telling this, and as someone who has publicly shared certain health challenges, right? So it's an interesting kind of moment to see her then talking about almost dying to give birth and linking her to this maternal morbidity and mortality crisis that we've been seeing for decades at this point, especially with the medicalization of birth, which is why it's so encouraging to see so many more Black doulas and midwives on the rise, and thinking about reproductive justice broadly, right? In addition to our fight for abortion care and access, right? Our those of us who would like to be birthing people, it is so important that we have real solutions to this problem. And we can't get to the real solutions if we deny misogynoir is part of the kind of care that folks are receiving. And that healthcare part, I mean, thinking about formerly incarcerated and incarcerated women in that, right? That I talk about the deaths of Black women in police custody was one way of me thinking through carceral violence. And so many of the cases that I come across that to this day with Black women who die in police custody, so much of it is medical neglect and easily things that could have been treated if only a modicum of care were afforded to these women. And that is gutting, because the healthcare ethic at least is right, do no harm. But when the do no harm ethic is still bent on the fact that if you were no one and figured as no one, when that is established as a kind of foundation for medicine, then do not harm, we need to qualify that as usually do not harm white people, do not harm rich people, do not harm thin people, do not harm cis people, do not harm straight people. And that combination, but doing harm to Black people, to gender expansive people, to poor people, to disabled people is literally what medical research is founded on in this nation. And so you marry that with the carceral logic and the criminalizing logics of the legal system, of policing, you're going to have kind of two death dealing systems coming together to be an unyielding death dealing force in the lives of Black women and girls.
Yes. And I think your point about do no harm is really interesting, because I found myself having similar thoughts about the ways in which you elevate how officer-involved shooting is a turn of phrase used to, kind of obfuscate police officers' responsibility. And how you're saying, right, do no harm does not apply to Black people because we are not perceived, our humanity is denied to us, we are not granted personhood in their eyes, feels the same as this officer-involved shooting, because there is this, there's an object to that. There is a person who was shot, but that phrase does not acknowledge, right? And it's intentionally done so, but it's because the object of that shooting is not granted personhood in the eyes of the public.
I mean, and finding out in the context of the research for this book that the popularization of that is the way that the media frames police killings, that was in the aftermath of a Black woman being killed by police, was just like, what? Right? So even the framing of how we talk about police violence in a contemporary context, we can map back to the killing of a Black woman over an unpaid utility bill, right? Who's killed literally with a money order in her purse for the minimum payment for that utility bill, right? That is where we get officer involved and where you get Black media pushback, which is why our outlets, our organizations, our collectives are so important in this fight, because the one paper that identified it as a police killing or a murder was a Black paper based in Los Angeles, which is where Eula Love was killed. But by the time it reaches the New York Times and the other papers of record across the country, it is officer involved, police involved. And to this day, you will see that. You will see it and you will know nothing because it tells you nothing. There's very big difference, right? If I say Sydney was involved in a shooting and Sydney shot someone, those are two completely different statements. If you were involved in a shooting, I could think you were shot or harmed. I could think you maybe were there. There's so many possibilities. And it is not immediately the one you think of, because if they were like, if she was the shooter, wouldn't they just say that? And we know that when we're attempting to criminalize people in the framing of things, we will name it. So we will know who had a gun. We will know if a person who's been shot by police had a gun. We'll know that immediately, or that they shot at police, but we won't see that police shot at them. There's a case that's happening right now where the police were trying to recover a young woman who was kidnapped after a murder. It's like a whole domestic violence kind of situation. And the reporting on it literally said, like, the girl ran towards police and collapsed. Like, there's no mentioning that there was a shooting and that this happened. It's completely inactive. It's so passive. And it works to pacify a kind of resistance to the normalcy of policing being violent. Because if you grew up believing that it was officer friendly, then police involved shooting, officer involved shooting, it's like, well, if there was a shooting, they had to shoot someone because they are officer friendly. But when you are intimately familiar with policing as a violent force in your communities, police involved shooting just sounds like an erasure of the kinds of violence and harm that often are on the other side of policing and criminalization.
Yeah, it's a total displacement of responsibility and culpability, right? That is placed on the person who is shot, and rather than the person who is doing the shooting, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's so important that we really interrogate the language that is used and the intentions that are undergirded. I appreciate you doing that so much throughout the work. And also just, as I was prepping for this, like unlivable living and careless care are so beautiful and clear, right? Like I know exactly what you are talking about when you are talking about those two things as they impact Black women and girls, right? Like, and so I really appreciate you creating this language to help us name what it means to interact with a medical establishment that doesn't care about you, and is the norm for Black women and girls, regardless of whether you have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system or not.
Yes. And I say this as someone who, right, has the privilege of being Dr. Lindsey, right? And you are Dr. McKinney. And I know when I go into a care setting, it's one of the few times I'm insistent about the doctor being present in my file somewhere, because I know it impacts the care I receive, right? And I clarify that I'm not a medical doctor, as I said, beyond my Grey's Anatomy and ER training. I was an ER watcher, right, of medicine. But I think that because we know that impact, because I know walking in as a Black woman, the kind of care I might receive, the chance that it may be subpar, may be careless, may be violent or harmful is too high for me not to use that tool. And yet the fact that I get to use that tool and so many of my sisters, my siblings don't, in this site, and will be disregarded and will be not believed and will be seen as overdramatic or problematic or criminal or angry when they are demanding to be cared for in the way that white patients are, is just a telling. And you compound that for Black women with womanhood, and we know the history of reading women as hysterical, as emotional, as incapable of assessing what is happening in their own bodies, right? This is definitely rooted in the misogyny and sexism that also undergirds the medical industrial complex, as well as the gross ableism, fat phobia, transphobia that also undergirds that. And so if you enter that space with multiple marginalized identities, the kind of care that you will receive immediately becomes more and more vile and more deplorable and more harmful. And when we want to talk about why Black people have cynical or downright negative and derisive views of the medical industrial complex, we need to return to this history, and we need to return to recent studies that tell us that there's still medical students right now who believe Black people don't feel pain the same way, or that their oximeters right now, a device that's used to measure oxygen levels, which determine how people received care with regards to COVID, particularly as we're thinking about it as a vascular and pulmonary infection, that meant that because this oximeter didn't read those rates right for African Americans and Black people more broadly, that often we weren't prioritized as significant cases to receive the kinds of treatments for COVID that could have been life-saving. So these have material, real consequences right now that matter deeply right now. And you use the racism of technology compounded with the misogyny of medicine. And that's where you get that medical misogynoir that we were talking about earlier, that has this fatal edge and certainly has a predisposition towards premature death, which is Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us, right, is a kind of framing of how we begin to think about, intently think about what racism is and how it operates.
Well, thank you so much. We are coming close to the end of our time, but
Okay.
I know it's flown by.
I know, right?
But I want to ask you, what is it that you want us to take away from this incredible book? Because Melissa Harris Perry is right. Like, there is hope in here. It is attempting to inspire, and I think is inspiring. So what is your call to action? And tell us, what do we need to do next?
So one of the best parts of this book is when I finally got to say, like, I have hope. Because if you read the book and you stop at like chapter 6, you might be like, so we're just doomed, right? There's no way out of this. It's so dire. It's just too despicable and violent and harmful. And what I wanted to start with is the people I'm learning from actively. I see citation as a way of holding myself accountable and also collaborating actively with other people doing this work. So I cited prison and police abolitionist Miriam Kaba and her framing of hope as a discipline, and what it meant to embrace that fully as a student of abolition who's still learning and thinking through and finding her way through this radical imagination that an abolitionist framework demands of us. And that is hopeful to me because I believe so strongly in the creativity, the imagination, in the tenacity, in the brilliance, in the genius of Black girls, women, and gender expansive people and minoritized people throughout the world, because our struggles are so interlinked and intertwined, particularly because of imperialism and colonialism, but also as minoritized people in terms of power throughout the world. And so I am hopeful because I see collectives doing this work. In a piece I wrote for Time, I think in July of 2020, I had a Twitter interaction with the amazing scholar Christina Sharp. And, we're talking about that framing of like, no one cares about Black girls. And it's something you'll hear a lot from people who mean well, right? They're like, we need to care more. No one cares. No one cares. I'm like, but Black women and girls care. We've been caring. Let me show you how much we've been caring. Let me show you the receipts of all of this work that we have done and continue to do. And even when those victories aren't immediately felt, there are things that have shifted the reality for so many Black women, girls, and gender expansive people. And so it was important for me to say that Black women and girls are not no one. So that doesn't mean as long as we're caring for one another, we are certainly showing up and showing out in terms of that. And that is hopeful. And that was why at the end, I wanted to list organizations such as this one that are doing this work that I want people to support financially with time and asking, what can I do? We're not even asking you to start something. We're asking you to start your journey in connection with community, that to join an organization, join community, join a collective, join an initiative, be part of a campaign, bring your unique skill sets and your genuine desire to see a different world be made possible. And that's what we need, the belief that this is possible. And that is in spite of unlivable living and careless care and the wholly impossible, that we've seen this. There are ancestors who believe certain things at certain points would have been unfathomable. They had to imagine a world that did not yet exist. And we are called to do the same as those of us with marginalized consciousness that is given to us through that. And so I'm hoping that people walk away from this book with some insight into what the problem is and what the stakes are, and who are some of the folks already doing this work, and looking, if you didn't see them, where in your community can you connect to be part of supporting this kind of work, right? Life affirming work, that's healing work, that's restorative work, that's reparative work, that's transformative work, that is abolitionist work that is about making new worlds possible.
I just want to say thank you so very much. This was an incredible discussion. I am certain everyone who joined us is as inspired as I am. And I just want to say thank you for the work that you do, your scholarship. I am so excited to read everything that you have written in the past and going forward, because it is just so incredibly thoughtful. I am so appreciative of the Black feminist historian frame that you bring to this. And it is it's just so important to be telling the stories of Black women and girls. And so I appreciate you and the work that you are doing.
Thank you so much. And, I just appreciate the work that y'all are doing. It's like such an amazing thing to be in this conversation with you. I saw some of the questions that came up in the comments, so thank y'all. I'll just quickly say, Black girls and women are not often afforded innocence and vulnerability. I hope with the book that we see what vulnerability is, my own vulnerability being part of this book, of sharing my own experiences with this. And I think that is definitely encased in misogynoir, why we never see Black women and girls as innocent. And we being like, we as like institutional we, not we on this call, deeply caring right now about Black women and girls. And yes, the methods are so important. Poetry, yes, you can see poetry throughout this book on the influence of how Black women create. I'm a dancer first. And so I danced throughout this book when I couldn't find the words. I danced first. Writing is like my third expressive-ish language. So I still, before this book, would have considered myself very much so like, I want to be a writer. And this book finally made me feel like a writer as an expressive. And so we need all tools. We need all tools on deck: the poetry, the dance, the art, the food, the culture, the spirituality, the nurturing, the massage. I mean, we need it all in this practice of getting free, that we have to practice getting free. And so I hope that this book is among many of the resources that we have in doing this incredibly important work.
Well, it is. And for those of you who have not read it, please go out and do so. I just want to thank you again. Before people jump off, I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to let you know that we have more book club events happening this year. So on October 17th, we will be talking to Dr. LaShawn Harris. She will be telling us about her incredible book called Sex Workers, Psychics, and Number Runners. She will also be talking to us about the work that she has been doing around the murder of Eleanor Bumpurs by police. She is in the process of writing some articles and some books, and so really trying to also elevate a relatively contemporary story of a Black woman who was killed by police in her home. And then in November, we will be speaking to Ms. Susan Burton, who is the executive director and founder of A New Way of Life, which is an incredible organization that is supporting formerly incarcerated women. And she has a book called Becoming Miss Burton that we are going to be talking about on November 9th. So please join our listserv for more updates about the book club and our work. And we just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Dr. Lindsey, it was truly an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Such an honor to be here. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone.